230 people are sitting on a Boeing 747, waiting for takeoff, families heading to Paris for vacation, couples on their honeymoon, a high school French club with 16 students and 5 chaperones. Everyone excited. Everyone ready for their trip across the Atlantic. The plane finally pushes back from the gate at JFK Airport. It's a beautiful summer evening. Clear skies, calm winds. Perfect flying weather. The Boeing taxis to the runway, engines roaring to life. And at 8:19 p.m., it lifts off into the New York sky. 12 minutes later, the plane explodes. A massive fireball erupts at 13,000 feet. Flaming wreckage rains down into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Long Island. 230 people instantly killed. No mayday call, no distress signal. No warning. Just a catastrophic explosion that tears the aircraft apart in mid. And here's the disturbing part. Hundreds of people on the ground saw it happen. They watched the plane explode. They saw a streak of light shoot up from the ocean toward the aircraft seconds before the blast. They reported it to the FBI. They testified under oath. They described what looked exactly like a missile hitting the plane, but the U.S. government spent 4 years and $130 million investigating this crash, and their official conclusion was that no missile was involved. It was a fuel tank explosion. An accident. Mechanical failure. Nothing more. So why did hundreds of eyewitnesses see something that the government says never happened? Why did the FBI confiscate evidence? Why did radar data show unidentified objects near the plane? And why, nearly 30 years later, do investigators, pilots, and even former government officials still believe the real cause of TWA Flight 800's destruction was covered up? This is one of the most controversial aviation disasters in history, and the mystery has never been solved. July 17, 1990s, John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York. 8 p.m. Trans World Airlines Flight 800 sat at the gate, boarding passengers for an overnight flight to Paris. The Boeing 747 was a massive aircraft, one of the largest passenger planes in the world. Seats for 430 people, though only 230 were booked that night. Most of the passengers were American tourists heading to France. The Montoursville High School French Club from Pennsylvania was on board. 16 teenagers and 5 adult chaperones, all excited for their trip to Paris. Families, couples, solo travelers, everyone settled into their seats as the flight attendants prepared the cabin for departure. The crew was experienced. Captain Ralph Kevorkian, a veteran pilot with thousands of flight hours. First Officer Stephen Snyder, equally qualified. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. At 8:02 p.m., the Boeing pushed back from Gate 27. It taxied slowly toward the runway. Air traffic control cleared them for takeoff. At 8:19 p.m., TWA Flight 800 lifted off, climbing into the evening sky over New York. The plane turned east, heading out over the Atlantic Ocean toward Europe. The lights of Long Island sparkled below. The sun had just set, leaving the sky in that deep purple twilight. Passengers relaxed. Some read books. Some watched the in-flight movie. Kids from the French club chatted excitedly about their upcoming trip. The flight attendants began preparing the meal service. Everything was perfect. But at 8:31 p.m., 12 minutes after takeoff, something catastrophic happened. The plane was climbing through 13,000 feet, about 8 miles off the coast of Long Island, when the center wing fuel tank exploded. A massive blast tore through the fuselage. The entire front section of the aircraft, including the cockpit and first-class cabin, separated from the rest of the plane and plummeted toward the ocean. The remaining fuselage, now without a nose, continued climbing for another 25 seconds, powered by the still-running engines, before it too fell from the sky. Flaming wreckage scattered across miles of ocean. 230 people died instantly. No survivors. No chance of survival. The explosion was so violent that pieces of the plane were found up to 4 miles apart, and hundreds of people on the ground witnessed it. Fishermen on boats off the coast of Long Island, people having dinner at beachside restaurants, pilots flying other aircraft in the area, and National Guard helicopter crew on a training mission. All of them saw the same thing, a bright streak of light rising from the ocean toward the plane, followed by a massive explosion. One witness, a retired Air Force pilot named Major Fritz Meyer, was flying his own plane near the area. He saw what he described as a flare or missile rise up from the surface and intercept TWA 800. He watched the fireball. He radioed it in immediately. Another witness, a fisherman named Mike Wire, was on his boat when he saw a bright white light shoot upward from the horizon, arc over, and then explode. He said it looked exactly like a missile he had seen during his time in the military. Dozens of other witnesses reported similar sightings. Streaks of light, objects rising from the water or from the land, and then the explosion. Within minutes, the FBI, the NTSB, the U.S. Navy, and the Coast Guard descended on the crash site. Debris was scattered across miles of ocean. Boaties floated in the water. Rescue boats searched desperately for survivors, but there were none. Everyone on board was dead. The investigation that followed became one of the most extensive and expensive in aviation history. The NTSB led the technical investigation into the crash. The FBI led a criminal investigation, treating the explosion as a potential terrorist attack or missile strike. U.S. Navy divers spent months recovering wreckage from the ocean floor, eventually retrieving 95% of the aircraft. The pieces were transported to a hangar in Calverton, New York, where investigators painstakingly reassembled the shattered Boeing like a massive three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. They were looking for evidence of what caused the explosion, and what they found was deeply disturbing. Chemical residues consistent with explosives were detected on some of the wreckage. The FBI brought in bomb-sniffing dogs. The dogs alerted on multiple pieces of debris, indicating the presence of explosive materials. Investigators found damage patterns that looked like high-velocity impacts, the kind caused by shrapnel from a warhead. Seats and certain sections of the plane had been peppered with tiny holes, as if something had torn through the fuselage at high speed. And then there was the radar data. Multiple radar installations tracked TWA 800's final moments. The primary radar showed the plane's normal flight path, climbing steadily. But seconds before the explosion, the radar detected unidentified objects near the aircraft. Fast-moving blips that appeared, merged with the plane's radar signature, and then disappeared. Some of these objects were traveling at speeds inconsistent with commercial aircraft. The radar data suggested something had intercepted Flight 800, but the U.S. military insisted there were no military exercises in the area that night. No ships, no submarines, no aircraft firing missiles. Nothing. The government's explanation for the radar anomalies was that they were false returns, ghost images caused by atmospheric conditions. But radar experts who reviewed the data disagreed. They said the returns were real objects. Something was out there. And then there were the FBI interviewed more than 700 people who claimed to have seen the explosion or events leading up to it. Of those, over 200 reported seeing a streak of light rise from the surface toward the plane. The FBI dismissed these accounts. They said the witnesses were mistaken, that what they saw was the plane itself, already on fire, climbing upward in its final moments before falling. But this explanation didn't match the witness descriptions. People saw the light before the explosion, not after. They saw it rise from the water or from land. They saw it move upward toward the plane. And many of these witnesses were pilots, military personnel, and trained observers who knew what they were looking at. Conspiracy theories exploded. The most prominent theory was that TWA 800 had been accidentally shot down by a U.S. Navy missile during a training exercise. Proponents of this theory pointed to the fact that the USS Normandy, a guided missile cruiser, was conducting exercises off the coast of Long Island that night. They argued that a missile had been fired, accidentally locked onto the civilian airliner, and struck Italiano. The government, desperate to avoid admitting such a catastrophic mistake, had covered it up. They pointed to the radar anomalies, the eyewitness accounts, the explosive residue, and the damage patterns as proof. Another theory suggested a terrorist attack, a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile launched from a boat or from the shore. In 1996, terrorism was a growing concern. The Oklahoma City bombing had happened the year before. There were fears of domestic and international terrorist groups operating in the U.S. Some believed that a terrorist cell had targeted TWA 800 and that the government was covering it up to avoid public panic. But despite 4 years of investigation, the FBI found no evidence of a criminal act. No terrorist group claimed responsibility. No missile fragments were recovered from the wreckage. No definitive proof of a bomb. And so, in the year 2000, the NTSB released its final report. The official conclusion was that TWA Flight 800 had been destroyed by an explosion in the center wing fuel tank caused by an electrical short circuit that ignited fuel vapors. Mechanical failure. An accident. Not a missile. Not a bomb. Just a tragic mechanical failure. But many people didn't believe it. Investigators who had worked on the case came forward and said they were pressured to ignore evidence. One NTSB investigator claimed that his superiors had dismissed findings that contradicted the fuel tank theory. Former FBI agents said they were told to stop pursuing certain leads. Whistleblowers alleged that evidence had been suppressed, that witness testimony had been discounted, and that the investigation had been steered toward a predetermined conclusion. The fuel tank theory itself was controversial. Boeing 747s had been flying for decades without their center wing tanks exploding. The conditions required for such an explosion were extremely rare. The tank had to be nearly empty, creating a vapor-air mixture in the perfect ratio. There had to be an ignition source, something hot enough to ignite the vapors, and the timing had to be exact. Critics argued that it was statistically improbable for all these factors to align at the exact moment. TWA 800 was 12 minutes into its flight. They pointed out that if fuel tank explosions were a real risk, there would have been other similar incidents, but there hadn't been. Not before TWA 800. Not since. It was a one-time event, an anomaly. And that made people suspicious. In 2013, a group of former investigators, including former NTSB and FAA officials, released a documentary called TWA Flight 800, in which they alleged a government They presented their evidence, including radar data, witness testimony, and forensic analysis, and argued that the plane had been brought down by a missile. They called for the case to be reopened. The NTSB refused. The agency stood by its original findings. They said the fuel tank explosion theory was sound, that all alternative explanations had been thoroughly investigated and ruled out, and that there was no... They dismissed the documentary as conspiracy theory speculation. But the controversy didn't go away. Even today, nearly 30 years later, the cause of TWA Flight 800's destruction remains one of the most debated topics in aviation history. Was it really a fuel tank explosion? Or was it a missile that the government refuses to acknowledge? The problem is that both scenarios have evidence supporting them, and both scenarios have massive holes. If it was a fuel tank explosion, why did so many credible witnesses see a streak of light before the blast? Why were there explosive residues on the wreckage? Why did the radar detect unidentified objects? Why did the damage patterns look like high-velocity impacts? And why did investigators claim they were pressured to ignore evidence? On the other hand, if it was a missile, where are the fragments? Why didn't any wreckage show definitive signs of a warhead detonation? Why didn't the Navy admit to the accident? Wouldn't covering up such a massive mistake be more damaging than admitting it? And why would the government risk the exposure of a conspiracy involving hundreds of people who worked on the investigation? Neither explanation is perfect, and that's what makes TWA Flight 800 so disturbing. We don't know the truth. We may never know. What we do know is that 230 people died that night. Families lost loved ones. The Montoursville High School French Club was devastated. 16 students and 5 chaperones gone in an instant. The entire town went into mourning. Parents, siblings, friends, all left without answers. Because even if the official explanation is correct, even if it was a fuel tank explosion, the fact remains that a Boeing 747 tore apart in midair for reasons that are still not fully understood. And if the official explanation is wrong, if there was a missile or a bomb, then the truth has been buried for 30 years. Some crashes are straightforward. Pilot error, mechanical failure. Whether the cause is clear, but TWA 800 is different. It sits in that uncomfortable space where the evidence points in multiple directions and the official story doesn't satisfy everyone. It's a case where reasonable, intelligent people can look at the same facts and come to completely opposite conclusions. And that ambiguity is terrifying, because if we don't know what brought down TWA 800, how can we be sure it won't happen again? How can we trust that the systems designed to keep us safe are actually working? The families of the victims have been asking these questions for 3 decades. Some believe the NTSB's findings. Others are convinced their loved ones were killed by something the government won't admit. And both groups are left with the same unanswered pain. The same need for closure that may never come. What happened to TWA Flight 800 on July 17th, 19? Did a fuel tank explode due to a freak electrical malfunction? Or did something else bring that plane down? A missile? A bomb? Something the investigation missed or deliberately ignored? We may never have a definitive answer, but what we do know is this. 230 people boarded a plane expecting a routine flight to Paris. 12 minutes later, they were dead. Their families deserve the truth. The flying public deserves the truth. And until that truth is undeniably proven, TWA Flight 800 will remain one of aviation's darkest unsolved mysteries. A fireball in the sky, a streak of light that hundreds saw but the government says didn't exist, and 230 lives lost in an explosion that, 30 years later, we still can't fully explain. The investigation consumed resources, time, and the careers of many who dared to question the official narrative. Investigators who spoke out found themselves marginalized. Witnesses who insisted on what they saw were dismissed as unreliable. The wreckage, painstakingly reassembled in that hangar, told a story that depended entirely on who was interpreting it. To some, it showed clear evidence of an external explosion. To others, it confirmed an internal fuel tank detonation. The same metal fragments, the same burn patterns, 2 completely different conclusions. This is the legacy of TWA Flight 800, not just the tragedy of 230 lives lost, but the ongoing debate about truth, evidence, and who gets to decide what really happened. Every year, on July 17th, memorials are held. Families gather. Names are read. Flowers are placed. And the question remains unanswered. What brought down that Boeing 747 on that summer evening in 1990s? The official story says mechanical failure. The witnesses say something else. And somewhere between those two versions of reality lies a truth that may be lost forever.